The contract was already on the table. The pens were already uncapped. And in 30 seconds, Vanessa Sterling was about to sign away $2 billion to the worst mistake of her life. She just didn't know it yet. The man who would save her wasn't sitting at that boardroom table. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was pushing a mop down the hallway outside, wearing a uniform with his name stitched over the pocket, carrying a secret so heavy it had already destroyed him once before. This is the story of what happened when the most dangerous mind in the room belonged to the man nobody bothered to look at. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one's going to take a while, and every minute of it is worth it. The 42nd floor of Hargrove Tower had a particular kind of silence that only existed during moments of maximum pressure. The kind of silence that wasn't really quiet at all, but rather a held breath stretched across an entire room. The kind that made the hum of the HVAC system sound like a freight train, and the scratch of a pen on paper sound like a verdict being read aloud. Vanessa Sterling had heard that silence more times than she could count. She'd grown up in it, in a sense, raised by a father who negotiated mergers the way other men played chess, slow and calculated and always 3 moves ahead. She'd inherited his instincts and sharpened them into something harder, faster, more aggressive. At 33, she was the youngest CEO in Hargrove Capital's 40-year history, and she had not gotten there by being sentimental about silence. But this particular Tuesday morning, even she felt the weight of it. The boardroom stretched the length of half a basketball court, all floor-to-ceiling glass on the eastern wall, Chicago sprawling below them in that flat gray January light that made the city look like it had been sketched in charcoal. The lake was invisible behind low clouds. The streets 42 floors down were just veins of yellow cab light and salt-stained concrete. Inside, 14 people sat around an oval table that cost more than most people's cars, and every single one of them was pretending to be calm. Vanessa was not pretending particularly hard. She stood at the head of the table with one hand resting on the back of her chair, the other holding a single printed page, the executive summary of the Meridian Capital acquisition package. 63 pages of financials, valuations, risk assessments, and legal frameworks had been condensed to this one sheet for the purpose of this meeting, which told her exactly how seriously certain people at this table had read the full documents, which was to say, not seriously enough. "Where are we on closing?" she asked. Derek Cho, her CFO, adjusted his glasses and checked his laptop. He was 47, silver at the temples, meticulous in the way that men who'd survived 3 corporate restructurings tended to be meticulous, careful about what he said, careful about what he didn't say. Legal just cleared the final rider. The Meridian team is standing by in conference room B. If you're ready to move, we can have signatures on the table by 11. It was 10:14. Projected synergies are holding at the numbers we discussed last week? Vanessa asked. Not because she didn't know the answer, because she wanted to hear Derek say it in front of everyone, on record, before she picked up a pen. Confirmed, Derek said. Post-integration upside of roughly 340 in the first 18 months, with the back-end asset realization pushing total value above $2 billion over a 5-year horizon. The market is going to respond well. The board already knows what's coming. This is a historic deal for Hargrove. A murmur of agreement moved around the table. There were smiles, so careful, professional smiles, the kind that stayed mostly in the eyes and didn't commit the mouth too far either direction. Thomas Wren, her head of acquisitions, uncapped his Mont Blanc and set it on top of his copy of the executive summary. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with the practiced ease of a man who'd sat in rooms like this for 30 years. He'd sourced the Meridian deal. He'd championed it internally for 8 months. He was the reason this acquisition had made it through 2 rounds of review and landed on Vanessa's desk as a priority close. "We've done everything right on this one," Thomas said. "The due diligence has been thorough. The legal exposure is minimal. The valuation is solid." He paused just long enough for the weight of his experience to settle. "I've been doing this longer than most people in this room have been working in finance, and I can tell you, this is as clean a deal as I've seen." Vanessa looked at him for a moment, not because she doubted him exactly, But because she had learned in the past 4 years of sitting in this chair that the people who said a deal was the cleanest they'd ever seen were usually the ones who needed it to be. "All right," she said, "let's bring the Meridian team up." That was the moment the door opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. The boardroom door was heavy and slow, the kind designed to open with authority and close with a soft hydraulic exhale. What it was not designed for was the gray cart that nudged it open from the outside, loaded with cleaning supplies, with a man behind it who clearly expected the room to be empty. He was tall, not aggressively tall, but enough that the doorframe registered him when he stepped through. Mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that suggested he'd once been something other than what he was now. His maintenance uniform was charcoal gray with Hargrove Facilities embroidered above the left chest pocket. His name was stitched on a patch below that, Mason. His face was weathered in a way that had nothing to do with sun, the weathering of someone who'd been through something significant and carried it quietly. Dark hair, a few days past needing a cut. Eyes that registered the room in about 2 seconds, with an alertness that seemed slightly out of place for the situation. He stopped. The cart's wheels squeaked on the polished floor and then went silent. 14 people looked at him. He started. "I was told this room was scheduled for a..." He checked the laminated card on his cart. 11:30 cleanup. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Thomas Wren said, without turning his head, "You've got the wrong room." Mason nodded and started to back the cart out. "Actually," Vanessa said, and her voice came out sharper than she'd intended, because she was tired and under pressure, and the last thing she needed right now was a disruption that would give the Meridian team any reason to question whether Hargrove had its house in order. "Do you think you could read a calendar, or at minimum check with your supervisor before wandering into a secured executive meeting?" Mason stopped backing up. He stood still for a moment. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't flush or look at the floor or offer the rapid, apologetic retreat that the room clearly expected. He just looked at her with an expression that she couldn't quite categorize. Not hostile, not wounded, not defensive, just steady, like someone absorbing information before deciding what to do with it. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice was even. "It won't happen again." He turned to go, and that was when it happened. He reached for the cart handle, and the motion pulled the sleeve of his uniform back past his wrist. Just a few inches, but enough to expose the inside of his right forearm. The skin there was covered in a tattoo, but not the kind that people typically put on forearms. No imagery, no names, no artistic design. What covered Mason Reed's forearm looked like the margin notes of a textbook, dense rows of compact notation, mathematical symbols, Greek letters, formula fragments, a series of small interlocking diagrams that resembled flowcharts more than any traditional tattoo artwork. It was strange enough that 2 people at the table actually leaned slightly forward. Thomas Wren's eyes flicked to it and away, dismissive. Vanessa noticed it. She didn't know why it registered the way it did. Maybe it was just the contrast, the absolute strangeness of financial notation rendered permanently into skin. But something about it made her hold her breath for a half-second before exhaling. Mason pulled the sleeve back down. He was almost out the door when he stopped. He didn't turn around completely. He turned just enough that his profile was visible, that weathered face, those careful eyes, and he said it quietly, almost like he was saying it to himself rather than to the room. "If you sign that contract today, you'll lose $2 billion by Friday." The room went so still that the HVAC hum surged back into audibility. Then Thomas Wren laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, the kind of laugh that wasn't really about humor. It was about restoring order, flattening the absurd thing that had just happened back into something manageable. 3 other people at the table joined in, the kind of reflexive social agreement that happens when someone with authority signals that something is beneath consideration. "Security escort would be appropriate," Thomas said to no one in particular, already looking back at his papers. But Vanessa was looking at Mason. He hadn't moved. He was still in that 3/4 profile, his hand on the cart handle, and he was looking back at her. Not at the room, specifically at her, and what she saw in his face was the one thing that the moment had no obvious explanation for. He wasn't performing. There was no bid for attention, no edge of desperation, no wild energy of someone making a wild claim. His face was the face of someone who had already accepted that they would not be believed, and had said it anyway because the alternative was walking out the door and letting it happen. "Stop," Vanessa said. Thomas looked up. "Vanessa, I said stop." She kept her eyes on Mason. "What did you just say?" Mason turned back to face the room fully. He looked at the table, at the papers, at the executive summary sitting in front of each chair. He looked at the Meridian acquisition package binder open on the credenza at the far end of the room. Then he looked at Vanessa. "Schedule F," he said. "The consolidated subsidiary earnings projections. Page 41 of the full acquisition document. The EBITDA calculations use a depreciation offset that doesn't align with the asset classification on Schedule K. It's not a rounding error. The spread is 11% over the 5-year horizon." Dead silence. 11% of the projected valuation on this deal, Mason continued, is somewhere between $1.8 and $2.2 billion, depending on how the liability cascade triggers on acquisition close. Thomas Wren put his pen down on the table, very carefully. The way you put something down when you're controlling a reaction. "Who are you?" Vanessa asked. "I work in building services," Mason said. "I clean this floor on Tuesday and Thursday mornings." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment. "My name is Mason Reed. I've worked in this building for about a year and a half." "And you've read our acquisition documents." "I found a discarded draft in the recycling bin on 38 about 6 weeks ago," he said. "I should have shredded it. I read it instead." Around the table, the silence had calcified into something harder. Not just awkward, but charged. The kind that arrives when a room full of intelligent people simultaneously realizes that the situation has just changed shape on them, and none of them are quite sure yet how far it has shifted. Thomas recovered first. "This is ridiculous," he said. He said it firmly, without anger, the way a man asserts authority when he feels it slipping. "Vanessa, this person does not have the training or the access to make any kind of meaningful assessment of a document of this complexity. He read a discarded draft 6 weeks ago and memorized a few numbers. This is a disruption, and a mildly concerning one from a confidentiality standpoint, and what we should do is have security remove him and deal with the document disposal issue separately." "What's the liability cascade?" Vanessa asked Mason. Thomas stopped talking. "The Meridian Group has 4 active subsidiaries," Mason said. He moved slightly, not forward exactly, but he settled into himself, the way people do when they're speaking about something they actually understand. 3 of them are structured as holding entities with pass-through liability clauses. Standard construction. But the 4th, Meridian Asset Partners, LLC, has a cross-collateralization agreement with 2 offshore entities registered in the Cayman Islands, Calder Holdings and a company called Forster Investment Group. Those agreements aren't disclosed in the acquisition package. They're disclosed in the subsidiary's own filings, which are publicly available but not incorporated into the due diligence documentation here. He paused. The cross-collateralization means that if Meridian Asset Partners carries a net debt position above a certain threshold at the time of acquisition close, the offshore entities can call on the acquirer's balance sheet. The threshold is already in breach, has been for about 11 months. The room was completely, utterly still. Vanessa looked at Derek Cho. Derek's face had gone the careful, controlled neutral that she recognized as the expression he wore when he was very rapidly recalculating something and didn't want anyone to know it. "You looked at the subsidiary filings?" Derek asked Mason. His voice was measured, but his jaw had tightened. "The relevant ones, yes." "Those aren't in the acquisition package." "No," Mason agreed. "They're not." Derek opened his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the deliberate precision of someone trying very hard not to look like they were in a hurry. Thomas leaned forward. "Vanessa, this is completely inappropriate. We have a signing in 45 minutes. We have a team sitting downstairs in conference room B. We have a deal that has gone through 2 rounds of review by 3 separate legal teams and 2 independent financial advisory firms. Are we really going to let a janitor with a forklift license and a partially read draft document hold up a $1 billion acquisition?" He doesn't have a forklift license, Vanessa said. Thomas blinked. What? Building services doesn't require it for this floor. I know because I signed off on the hiring parameters for this level 18 months ago. She looked at Thomas steadily. Small detail, unimportant. I'm just noting that you're assuming things about him the same way you're assuming he's wrong. The temperature in the room dropped approximately 3 degrees. Vanessa pulled out the chair she'd been standing behind and sat down. She looked across the table at Mason Reed, who was still standing near the door with his cleaning cart, in his charcoal uniform, with his strange tattooed arm and his quiet, certain eyes. Sit down, she said. He looked at the chair she was gesturing to, midway along the table, between 2 senior analysts, and then he looked at her like he was checking whether she was serious. Sit down, she said again, and take me through it, all of it. What happened over the next 90 minutes was the kind of thing that people in that room would describe differently depending on who they were and what they needed the story to mean. The Meridian signing was postponed. The call to conference room B was brief and cold, delivered by Vanessa's executive assistant with no explanation beyond a scheduling conflict requiring an unexpected delay. The Meridian team pushed back, politely, then less politely, and were told that the delay was necessary and that rescheduling would be communicated within 24 hours. Thomas Wren spent the first 30 minutes visibly calibrating between 2 responses. The response of a man who was certain he was right and wanted to establish it publicly, and the response of a man who was beginning to feel the particular cold sweat of someone who might not be. He kept his face settled into the first while the second was clearly running underneath it. Mason sat at the table, not comfortably exactly, in the way a man doesn't sit comfortably at a table he wasn't meant to sit at, but without visible self-consciousness about it, and walked Vanessa through the numbers the way a person does when the numbers are so deeply familiar they no longer require effort. He used a whiteboard. He pulled it from the far corner of the room himself, without asking permission, the way someone does when they need a tool and the tool is available and asking permission would just waste time. He wrote quickly, the notation spare and efficient, and the tattoo on his forearm, partially visible where he'd pushed the sleeve up, mirrored some of what he was writing in its density and its logic. Derek Cho, initially silent and watchful, began asking questions within the first 20 minutes. Quiet, technical questions. Not the questions of a man challenging an argument, but the questions of a man following it carefully. That was the moment Vanessa knew. Not the full picture, not yet. But she knew the shape of it. The Schedule F discrepancy was real. Derek confirmed it by the 40-minute mark, pulling the original subsidiary documentation on his laptop, his face going progressively more still as he worked through it. The cross-collateralization clause was buried in a 60-page subsidiary operating agreement for Meridian Asset Partners that had been referenced in the acquisition package's index, but never explicitly incorporated into the risk analysis. Why wasn't this flagged? Vanessa asked at one point, not to Mason, but to the room. No one answered immediately. The 2 advisory firms we retained for independent review, Derek said finally, carefully, were working from the documentation package as compiled by the acquisition team. Vanessa looked at Thomas. Thomas's Mont Blanc was on the table in front of him. He hadn't picked it up since the first 30 minutes. The documentation package was compiled according to standard industry practice, he said. His voice was steady. He was a man who had been in rooms like this before, in difficult moments before, and he had the skill of staying level even when level was costing him something. Subsidiary-level filings aren't typically incorporated at the primary due diligence stage unless flagged as material. The advisory firms didn't flag them. Because they only reviewed what was in the package, Vanessa said. That is standard industry practice, Thomas repeated. And the cross-collateralization agreement, Vanessa said, was it ever specifically reviewed by any member of this team or either advisory firm? The silence that followed was its own answer. Mason hadn't said anything for the past 15 minutes. He'd stepped back from the whiteboard and was standing to one side, watching the room work through what he'd already worked through weeks ago in an apartment in Pilsen while his daughter slept in the next room, and he tried to figure out what to do with what he knew. The debt position in breach, Vanessa said, turning back to him. You said 11 months. Approximately, Mason said, based on the most recent quarterly filing available publicly. The actual figure at acquisition close could be worse depending on what's happened in the past 90 days. And the offshore entities have the right to call on the acquirer's balance sheet. If net debt exceeds the threshold at the time of close, yes, the trigger language is fairly explicit. What's the exposure range? At the low end, assuming the breach hasn't worsened significantly, somewhere around 1.6 billion. At the high end, if there's been additional liability accumulation in the offshore entities, potentially north of 2.5. Derek closed his laptop. He opened it again. He looked at Vanessa with the expression of a man who had just done a calculation he very much did not want to have been correct about. "I need to put the full team on this today," he said. "Yes," Vanessa said. "You do." She stood up. The room stood up in the reflexive way rooms do when the CEO stands. She looked at Thomas Wren, who was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something complicated moving behind his composed exterior, something she filed away and did not examine yet because there was too much else to manage right now. "Thomas," she said, "I want you in the room with Derek's team all day. Full transparency on the documentation trail." Something shifted in Thomas's face. "Of course," he said. Vanessa turned to Mason. He was already beginning to move toward his cleaning cart near the door, putting the room back in the order it had been in before he'd arrived. The quiet efficiency of someone who did not expect to be thanked for the disruption he'd caused, however necessary it had been. "Mr. Reed," she said. He stopped and turned. She meant to say something efficient and appropriate for the situation. A formal acknowledgement, a brief expression of appreciation, the language of someone managing a complicated moment professionally. What came out instead was something slightly more unvarnished. "How long have you known?" He looked at her. "About the acquisition?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Since I read the draft. 6 weeks, roughly. And you've been working on this floor?" "Yes." "Walking past this boardroom?" He held her gaze. "Yes." She let a beat pass. "Why today? Why not sooner?" He seemed to consider this genuinely. Not performing consideration, actually considering. "I didn't know when the signing was," he said finally. "I found out this morning. The schedule was posted on the facilities board for floor-level cleaning coordination." A brief pause. "I wasn't supposed to find out at all." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. This man with the cleaning cart and the improbable knowledge and the tattoo that looked like it had been put there by someone who needed to carry certain things with them wherever they went and couldn't trust paper to hold them forever. "You can go," she said. And then, because it was the thing that was true, and the least she could say, and maybe the hardest thing for a person in her position to say to a person in his, "Thank you." Mason nodded once. He moved the cart out through the door. The door closed behind him with the soft hydraulic exhale that it always closed with, as if nothing had happened. The room sat with what remained. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Derek Cho's finance team had completed a preliminary review of the offshore subsidiary filings. By 5 o'clock, they had located the cross-collateralization agreement and run a preliminary breach calculation. The number they arrived at was $1.9 billion. Derek called Vanessa into his office at 5:47 and showed her the figure on his screen. He didn't say anything when he did it. He just showed her the number and waited. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "How solid is this calculation?" "Preliminary," Derek said. "We'll need the full forensic picture, but the framework is solid. The clause is real, the breach is documentable, and the trigger language is unambiguous." He paused. "If we'd signed this morning, we would have inherited this liability at close. Probably within 30 to 60 days of close, the offshore entities would have initiated the call. Depending on how our liquidity looked at the time, it would have been catastrophic," Vanessa said. Derek looked at his screen. "Yes," he said, "it would have been catastrophic." She stood at his office window for a moment and looked down at Chicago in the early dark of a January evening, the city lights coming on in the flat cold, the lake somewhere beyond the west buildings, invisible. She thought about Mason Reed pushing a cleaning cart down the 42nd floor corridor, with $1.9 billion of information in his head. She thought about the moment he'd said it, and the laughter in the room, and the expression on his face, not wounded, not vindicated, just steady. A man who'd said a thing because it needed to be said, and had managed his own reaction to not being believed before he'd even finished saying it. She thought about the tattoo. "Derek," she said, "pull everything we have on an employee in building services named Mason Reed. Whatever the HR files have, employment history, prior positions listed on his application, anything." Derek turned from his computer. "Vanessa, quietly," she said. "Don't make it a thing. Just get me what we have." She went back to her office and stood at the glass wall that faced the city and did not sit down for a long time. The Meridian team had been officially informed of an indefinite postponement at 4:15 that afternoon. The response had been what she expected, a mixture of confusion and escalating pressure that she had routed through legal with instructions to hold the line without explanation. There would be fallout. There was always fallout, but $1.9 billion. She turned from the window and picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the cell number for her chief of security, a former federal investigator named Patricia Voss, who had worked for Hargrove Capital for 11 years and had the rare quality of not asking more questions than were necessary. "Pat," Vanessa said when the call connected, "I need you to do something for me first thing tomorrow morning, quietly, carefully, and completely off the record." "Sure," Patricia said. "What do you need?" Vanessa looked at the Chicago skyline through her office glass, the 42nd floor above a city she'd been in for 15 years and still sometimes felt like a stranger in. The same city that was home to a man who mopped floors and had once been something else entirely, and had numbers tattooed on his arm like armor or memory or both. "I need to know who Mason Reed really is," she said. "One. On the other side of the city, in a third-floor apartment in Pilsen with 2 windows facing the street, and a kitchen that smelled like the pasta he'd made for dinner, Mason Reed was sitting on the floor of his daughter's room. Emma was 7. She'd fallen asleep mid-sentence the way she often did. One moment talking about something that had happened at school, the next gone completely. Head tilted sideways on the pillow, dark hair across her face, one arm still reaching toward where he'd been sitting. He'd moved closer to fix her blanket and just stayed there. He thought about the boardroom. He thought about the woman at the head of the table, Vanessa Sterling, who he knew from the Hargrove organizational charts he'd seen in various thrown-away documents over a year and a half of cleaning the 42nd floor. He thought about the moment she'd looked at him and told him to sit down. He thought about whether he'd made a mistake, not in stopping. He didn't regret stopping. He'd known what was in that acquisition package for 6 weeks, and he'd spent 6 weeks deciding what to do about it, running the math on the consequences of saying something against the math on the consequences of staying quiet, and staying quiet had never actually been an option. He just hadn't known that until the moment he was almost through the door and turned back around. What he didn't know yet was what came next. Emma murmured something in her sleep and shifted, her hand finding his knee and settling there with the unconscious certainty of a child who had never had reason to doubt that her father would be close enough to reach. He put his hand over hers. Outside, the city went on doing what the city did. Noise and cold and light and the particular restless persistence of a place that had been knocked down enough times to stop being surprised about it. Chicago in January. All those millions of people in all those lit windows, carrying whatever they carried. Mason Reed sat on the floor of his daughter's room and held her hand and waited to see what Tuesday had set in motion. Patricia Voss delivered the HR file on Mason Reed at 7:52 Wednesday morning, before the building's main elevator banks were even fully operational. She set a single manila folder on Vanessa's desk, poured herself coffee from the credenza without asking, a privilege she'd quietly accumulated over 11 years, and sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited. Vanessa picked up the folder. The employment application was 3 pages. The work history section listed 2 prior positions, a financial consulting firm called Arbor Advisory Group, where Mason had worked for 2 years, and before that a 7-year tenure at a company called Whitfield Vance Partners. Both were listed without elaboration. No titles, no specific role descriptions, just the names and the dates, The way someone fills out a form when they're trying to get hired for a job that has nothing to do with what they used to do, and they don't want anyone asking questions they've already decided not to answer. References listed: none. Emergency contact: Emma Reed, age 7. Relationship: daughter. Vanessa looked at that line for a moment longer than the others. Whitfield Vance, she said. I know, Patricia said. Vanessa looked up. Patricia's face was doing the thing it did when she already knew something and was waiting to be caught up to. Tell me, Vanessa said. Patricia set her coffee down. Whitfield Vance Partners was one of the 10 largest private investment management firms in the country until about 4 years ago. They managed somewhere north of $60 billion in assets at their peak. Institutional clients, sovereign wealth funds, a significant book of high-net-worth private accounts. She paused. 4 years ago, they were the subject of a federal investigation into systematic misrepresentation of fund performance, the kind where the fund managers were reporting returns that bore no meaningful relationship to actual portfolio performance. They'd been doing it for at least 6 years. I remember that case, Vanessa said. Vaguely. I was deep in the middle of our Midwest portfolio restructuring when it broke. The investigation was opened largely based on a referral from a forensic analyst who had been working inside the firm, Patricia said. The referral was detailed enough that the SEC had a roadmap before they'd done a single document review. Whoever put it together understood the structure of what had been done and documented it in a way that made it extremely difficult to contain or discredit. Mason Reed, Vanessa said. The analyst is never publicly identified in any of the SEC filings. The referral is attributed to an unnamed internal source. Patricia picked up her coffee again. But I made some calls this morning, not official calls, calls to people who were around that investigation at the time and remember the inside of it. Vanessa waited. The analyst who blew that case open, Patricia said, was the head of forensic analysis at Whitfield Vance. Mid-30s at the time, unusual hire. They'd brought him in to strengthen their compliance infrastructure. What they didn't account for was that he was actually going to use it. A brief pause. After the referral, the firm's senior partners managed to avoid criminal prosecution through a civil settlement. Several of them relocated. 2 of them are still active in the industry under different corporate structures. And the analyst? Patricia looked at her steadily. Blacklisted. It happened fast and it happened thoroughly. No firm in the sector would touch him. The industry has a long memory for people who create inconvenient federal investigations, even when those investigations are entirely warranted. She set her cup down. Within 8 months of the Whitfield Vance settlement, he'd lost his Series 65 certification through what appears to have been a coordinated complaint process. Multiple firms filed conduct grievances simultaneously, which is unusual enough to be notable. The complaints were never substantiated, but the process took long enough to run out his renewal window. Vanessa stared at the folder. They took his license. They made the process impossible to complete while it was under dispute. Technically, it lapsed. Practically, it was taken. The office was quiet. Down below, Chicago was doing its morning thing. The city coming back to life in the gray January light. All those people with all those mornings, most of them simpler than this one. He has a daughter, Vanessa said. Not as a question. 7 years old. He's been her sole caregiver since she was about 4, based on what I was able to piece together. Mother's not in the picture. Vanessa closed the folder. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at Patricia. He read a discarded draft of our acquisition package, she said. Identified a liability exposure of potentially $2 billion, carried that information for 6 weeks while cleaning our floors, and walked into our boardroom by accident yesterday and tried to stop us signing anyway. Patricia held her gaze. Yes. While raising a 7-year-old alone on a building services salary. That appears to be accurate. Vanessa said nothing for a moment. Then, how do the Whitfield Vance partners feel about him? Currently, Patricia's expression shifted slightly. That's a question worth sitting with, she said. Based on what my contacts told me, at least 2 of those former partners have remained active in the Chicago financial sector. There's a reasonable possibility that Mason Reed working anonymously in a building services role isn't entirely coincidental. It may be the only way he's been able to stay employed in this city without triggering another coordinated effort to make his life difficult. Vanessa absorbed that. You're saying he's been hiding? I'm saying a man with his background doesn't end up pushing a mop on the 42nd floor of a financial services tower by accident. He ended up there because he needed work that wouldn't attract attention from people who already demonstrated they're willing to be systematic about destroying him. The silence after that had some weight to it. Vanessa stood up and went to the window. The city was below her, flat and wide and cold, running all the way to the horizon in every direction. She thought about Mason sitting on that floor with his daughter's hand in his. She didn't know that specific image. She'd constructed it from the file, from the emergency contact line, from the particular quality of steadiness she'd seen in his face when she'd watched him absorb being laughed at and said his piece anyway. Get me a meeting with him, she said. Today, if possible. Somewhere not here. Patricia raised an eyebrow. Does he know he's getting a meeting? No, that's the other part of what I'm asking. Patricia nodded and stood. She picked up her folder, took a last sip of coffee, and was at the door before Vanessa spoke again. Pat. Vanessa turned from the window. Whatever you're thinking about how this ends, don't think it yet. There are a few more chapters to get through first. Patricia looked at her with the expression of someone who had worked for her long enough to find the statement both characteristic and mildly exasperating. I'll get you the meeting, she said, and left. The meeting happened at 12:30 in a coffee shop on South Wabash called Foundry that occupied the ground floor of a converted loft building and had exposed brick, mismatched chairs, and the particular unpretentious functionality of a place that had been serving the same neighborhood for 15 years, without trying to be anything other than what it was. Vanessa got there 10 minutes early and sat facing the door and ordered a black coffee she didn't particularly want. She'd worn a coat she owned but rarely used, a practical gray wool that didn't read as CEO of a billion-dollar firm, which was the point. She'd left the town car parked 3 blocks away. None of this was for performance. She just understood, in some functional way, that the conversation she needed to have was not the kind that worked well when conducted across a power differential that was already significant enough on its own. Mason came in at 12:31. He was out of the uniform, which was the first time she'd seen him in anything else. Dark jeans, a plain navy Henley, the same worn jacket he'd apparently walked over in because it was the one he owned. He looked different out of the uniform and also exactly the same. He saw her immediately, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He came over and sat down. You looked me up, he said. I did, she said. He nodded slowly like this was the expected move in a sequence he'd been tracking. He picked up the menu, looked at it for about 2 seconds, set it back down. The waitress came over and he ordered a coffee without looking at the prices, which she noted. Whitfield Vance, she said. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. What do you want to know? I already know most of it, she said. I want to know what you think about it now. Not then, now. 4 years out. He was quiet for long enough that the waitress came back with his coffee, and he wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking it. I think I was right, he said, about what I found, about what it meant. I'd do the same thing again. A brief pause. I think I underestimated how organized the response would be. That part I got wrong. I thought the exposure would be enough. I didn't understand that people with that much to lose have already thought through every possible response to exposure before you've even started. They took your license. They manufactured enough procedural noise to make the renewal process impossible in the time available. It's a very effective technique when you have enough institutional relationships to pull the right levers. He said it without bitterness. Just factually, the way you describe the mechanics of something that happened to you, and that you've moved far enough past to see clearly. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Were you aware when you came to Hargrove Capital that any of the former Whitfield Vance partners were operating in connected entities in the Chicago market? His hand stilled around the coffee cup. It was subtle, the kind of stillness that happened when something landed. Why are you asking that? He said. Because Patricia Voss, my chief of security, thinks it's a reasonable possibility that you chose building services in this particular building for reasons that had nothing to do with the building specifically, that you needed work that kept you below a certain radar. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing she'd first seen in the boardroom, absorbing information, deciding what to do with it, not performing either way. I knew that Langford Group, which is a real estate and investment advisory firm that operates out of floors 30 through 35 of Hargrove Tower, was partially funded through a capital vehicle connected to two of the former Whitfield Vance senior partners, he said. When I found the job listing for building services, it was posted on a city employment board, not a financial sector board. I figured that if they were in the building, they probably weren't spending a lot of time looking at the maintenance staff roster. Vanessa sat with that. You've been in this building, on their floors. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, he said. 30 through 35 on the early rotation. And they've never recognized you. People don't look at maintenance workers, he said. It's not a comment on them particularly, it's just true. You don't register someone who's cleaning a hallway. They've walked past me with maybe 18 inches between us. Vanessa thought about that. The strange, specific vertigo of it. A man who had once been a significant enough figure in the financial sector to blow open a $60 billion fraud investigation, reduced by coordinated institutional retaliation to invisible labor in the same building as the people who'd done the reducing. Walking past each other in corridors, neither side acknowledging the other's existence. The Meridian acquisition, she said. Did you know about the Langford Group connection when you flagged it? Something changed in his expression. Small, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in the set of his jaw. What Langford Group connection? He said. Vanessa looked at him. Derek Cho's team has been working through the documentation trail since yesterday. This morning they found that Calder Holdings, one of the offshore entities in the cross-collateralization agreement, has a capital structure that includes a passive investment vehicle connected to Langford Group. Mason was very still. They're in the Meridian deal, she said. He looked down at his coffee. She could see him recalculating, not performing recalculation, actually doing it, the way someone does when a data set they thought they understood has just revealed a new variable. I didn't know that, he said quietly. I believe you, she said. And she did. Because if he'd known it, the situation would have felt different, more urgent, more personal. What she saw in his face now was something simpler and more complicated at the same time. The expression of a man who had walked back into a room he thought he understood and found it was bigger than he'd realized. How deep is the connection? He asked. Derek's still working it out. The passive vehicle layers are designed to obscure. What we know is that the connection exists and that the scale of it would make the Langford involvement material to any decision-making about the Meridian deal. If the Meridian acquisition had closed, Mason said slowly, and the liability cascade had triggered, Hargrove Capital would have been in crisis, Vanessa said. Significant crisis. The kind that creates opportunities for well-positioned competitors to acquire distressed assets at favorable valuations. He looked at her. Langford Group, she said, has been circling two of our core asset portfolios for the past 18 months. We've rebuffed two informal approaches. The coffee shop moved around them. The ordinary midday movement of a neighborhood place, people coming and going, conversations overlapping, someone's phone playing a voice message too loud in the corner. Normal life, happening in parallel to a conversation that was turning over something much less ordinary. They were going to let you sign it, Mason said. Not as a question. Someone inside my company was going to let me sign it, Vanessa said, and then wait for the cascade to play out. He looked at her steadily. Thomas Wren. She said nothing. He sourced the deal, Mason said. He championed it internally. He compiled the documentation package that excluded the subsidiary filings. He was the loudest voice in the room when I said what I said. We're still establishing the full picture, Vanessa said carefully. Derek's team and legal are working a parallel track. I'm not asking for a legal conclusion, Mason said. I'm telling you what the structure looks like. You can always tell when someone's built something to fail in a specific direction. There's a shape to it. The excluded documentation, the advisory firms working from a curated package, the timing of the signing. Someone needed the deal to close before anyone looked too closely. Vanessa held his gaze. How long have you been carrying this? What you know about Whitfield Vance, about what was done to you, about the people who did it being 40 floors below where you work every week. He was quiet for a moment. You're asking whether I'm angry. I'm asking whether you're okay, she said. It came out more directly than she'd intended. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not guarded exactly, but careful, the way someone looks when they've been asked something that gets close to something real. I have a 7-year-old daughter, he said. She needs a father who is functional and present. Being angry is a luxury I don't spend a lot of time on. He picked up his coffee finally and drank. I'm okay. Most days. Vanessa nodded. She looked at her own coffee, which had gone from too hot to drink to probably past its best, and she drank it anyway. I owe you an apology, she said. He looked up. In the boardroom yesterday, she said, the way I spoke to you before you said what you said, that was... She stopped, started again. I was under pressure and I took it out on someone who didn't deserve it, and I need to say that plainly. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't know. That's not an excuse, she said. I spoke to you like you weren't worth my attention before I knew anything about you. That would have been wrong no matter who you turned out to be. She looked at him steadily. I'm sorry. He didn't deflect it or minimize it, which she appreciated. He just sat with it for a moment and then nodded once, the way someone does when an apology is genuine and they're choosing to accept it without making a production of either the wound or the healing. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat with that for a beat. Then Mason set his cup down and said, the Langford connection in the Meridian deal, the passive vehicle. What's Derek's timeline on mapping the full structure? He thinks 48 to 72 hours for a preliminary picture. Full forensic clarity could take longer. If I could see the subsidiary filings, the full set, not just Meridian asset partners, I could probably cut that timeline significantly. She looked at him. You're offering to help. I'm offering to look at numbers, he said. It was a small distinction, but not a trivial one. He wasn't offering himself as a resource or a solution. He was just offering to do the thing he could do, the way a person with a specific skill offers it when it's needed and they happen to be present. You'd be doing it as a building services employee reviewing confidential acquisition materials, she said. That's a complicated position. It was complicated yesterday too, he said. Didn't stop it from mattering. She looked at him for a long moment. This man with the worn jacket and the coffee going cold and the tattoo covered by a sleeve and the 7-year-old waiting somewhere across the city. I'll talk to legal, she said. There's a framework for temporary consulting engagement that could cover you appropriately. It wouldn't be official yet, but it would put a structure around the work. He nodded. Okay. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The people from Whitfield Vance who are in this building, she said. If the Langford connection to the Meridian deal becomes fully established, if what Derek's team finds is what I think they're going to find, this goes to the same place the last one went, federal level. And this time it's not just financial manipulation. This is deliberate sabotage of a public company's acquisition process. I know, he said, which means the people who spent 4 years making sure you stayed invisible are going to know you were the one who stopped it. He looked at the table, then at her. His face was steady in that particular way of his. Not calm exactly, but resolved, like a person who had already had the conversation with themselves about what a thing might cost, and had made their peace with the cost before they decided whether to do the thing. Yeah, he said. I figured. Outside, the midday city moved through its January light. Traffic sounds, a siren somewhere distant, the particular Chicago wind that came off the lake and found you wherever you were. Vanessa gathered her coat and stood. Mason stood too. Tomorrow morning, she said. 8 o'clock. Come to the 42nd floor. I'll have Patricia meet you at the elevator and bring you up through the executive corridor, not through building services. He looked at her with something that might have been, briefly, a kind of recognition, the acknowledgement of a gesture that meant something specific without either of them needing to say what that was. 8 o'clock, he said. She left first. He stayed and finished his coffee, sitting with the afternoon moving around him in Foundry's easy noise, thinking about numbers and daughters, and the particular way certain things you thought were finished had a way of not being finished at all. Mason arrived at 7:58. Patricia Voss was already at the elevator bank when the doors opened, standing with a visitor badge and the particular stillness of someone who had been in high-pressure situations long enough that waiting had become indistinguishable from calm. She handed him the badge without ceremony, looked him over once in the way of someone conducting a rapid professional assessment, and said, "Conference room 4, not the main boardroom." "Okay," Mason said. "The team knows you're coming. Most of them have questions. You don't have to answer the ones that aren't about the numbers." He looked at her. "Noted." They rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened on 42, the floor felt different than it did on cleaning mornings. Not because it had changed, but because he was different in it. Same carpet, same glass walls, same low hum of expensive equipment running behind closed doors. But he was walking through it as something other than invisible, and that changed the geometry of the space in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. Conference room 4 was a smaller, more functional version of the main boardroom. No floor-to-ceiling glass, no oval table built to impress. A rectangular table, 8 chairs, 2 whiteboards, a wall monitor that was already running financial data when he walked in. Derek Cho was there, with 3 members of his finance team whose names Mason didn't yet know. A lawyer named Carmen Reyes from Hargrove's legal division sat at the far end with a yellow legal pad and an expression of focused caution. Vanessa was not in the room. Derek stood when Mason entered, which seemed to cost him something. Not because he was unwilling, but because it was the kind of gesture that acknowledged a recalibration he was still completing. "Mr. Reed," he said. "Thanks for coming in." Mason said. He set his jacket on the back of a chair and looked at the wall monitor. "Walk me through what you have so far." Derek sat back down and nodded to the youngest member of his team, a woman named Priya who looked about 27 and had the focused, slightly sleepless quality of someone who had been working a document trail for 36 hours straight. She pulled up the working file on the monitor. "Okay," she said, and launched directly into it without preamble, which Mason appreciated. "We've confirmed the cross-collateralization clause and documented the breach. That part is solid. What we're still working through is the full ownership structure of the 2 offshore entities, Calder Holdings and Forster Investment Group, because the layering is deep and it's not linear." "Show me the top-level structure first," Mason said. Priya pulled it up. A flowchart of sorts, boxes and lines representing entities, ownership percentages, jurisdictions. It was the kind of diagram that looked organized on the surface and dissolved into noise the longer you stared at it, which was usually the point. Mason looked at it for about 45 seconds without speaking. Then he moved to the whiteboard. "The passive vehicle connecting Langford Group to Calder Holdings," he said. "What jurisdiction is it registered in?" "Delaware?" Priya said. "Shell company. Formed about 3 years ago." 3 years ago, Mason repeated. He wrote the name on the board, Calder Holdings. Drew a line, wrote Langford Group. "What's the company name?" "Arclight Capital Advisors, LLC." He stopped writing for just a moment, then continued. "Does Arclight have any disclosed officers or directors?" "One listed manager," Priya said, "a name that keeps coming back as a nominee director across about a dozen similar structures. Probably a professional nominee service. Someone who lends their name to corporate registrations for a fee and has no real involvement. Run the nominee name through the other structures in this web," Mason said. "Not for the nominee, for the law firm or registered agent handling the registrations. They'll all be using the same one. That's the thread." Priya typed. Derek watched Mason with an expression that had been slowly shifting since the meeting started, from the careful neutrality of someone withholding judgment to something that was not quite respect yet but was adjacent to it. "What are you looking for specifically?" Derek asked. "Pattern of construction," Mason said. He turned from the board. "These structures are built, not grown. When someone builds a liability concealment architecture this elaborate, they use tools they're familiar with. Same law firms, same nominee services, same jurisdictional preferences. It's like handwriting. If you've seen it before, you recognize it." "And you've seen this before," Derek said. Mason held his gaze. I've seen something similar. Derek understood what that meant. Carmen Reyes, the lawyer, looked up from her legal pad. Mr. Reed, Carmen said carefully, if you're suggesting that this structure shares characteristics with structures you encountered in a prior professional context, I'm not suggesting anything formally, Mason said. I'm telling you what the numbers look like and what I know about what they mean. What you do with that is your call and your lawyer's call. Carmen wrote something on her pad. Priya looked up from her keyboard. The registered agent, she said. All three offshore entities use the same one, a firm called Meridian Island Services Limited, registered in the Caymans. Mason turned back to the board. Same agent as the Whitfield Vance Offshore Structures, he said, quietly, mostly to himself. But the room heard it. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when a room collectively realizes it has just moved from one kind of conversation to a different and more serious one. Derek leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way a man does when he's recalculating the scale of something. This isn't just a bad deal, Derek said. No, Mason said. It's not. Vanessa had been in her office for an hour by the time Carmen Reyes knocked on the open door at 10:15 and came in with her yellow legal pad and the specific expression of a lawyer who had something to say and was choosing her words with professional precision. Conference room 4 has developed a direction, Carmen said. Tell me. Carmen sat down. Mason Reed has connected the registered agent servicing the Meridian offshore entities to structures he encountered during his time at Whitfield Vance Partners. The same agent, which would mean the people who built those structures and the people who built these structures have a professional relationship that predates the Meridian deal by at least 4 years. Vanessa looked at her steadily. Which people? That's what we're still establishing, Carmen said. But the circumstantial picture is becoming fairly compelling. She paused. There's also a documentation issue we've found that is more immediately relevant. Go on. The due diligence package for the Meridian acquisition, the compiled set that was provided to both independent advisory firms. We've been comparing it to the original document set received from Meridian's legal team at the start of the process. Carmen opened her legal pad. 7 documents that were present in the original receipt log are absent from the compiled due diligence package, including the Meridian Asset Partners Subsidiary Operating Agreement, including the cross-collateralization disclosure. The room got very quiet. Those documents didn't fall out by accident, Vanessa said. No, Carmen said. They didn't. Someone with access to the compiled package after receipt and before distribution to the advisory firms removed them. She looked at Vanessa with the carefully calibrated expression of someone delivering a conclusion she has verified thoroughly enough to stand behind. The access log for the document management system is narrow. 3 people had the necessary permissions at the relevant time window. 2 of them have been with this company for over a decade with no prior compliance issues. And the third, Vanessa said. Carmen looked at her. Thomas Wren. Thomas Wren's office was on the north side of the 42nd floor, with a view of the river, and on clear days, the pale line of the lake beyond the northern skyline. It was a corner office, which he'd earned in the specific way corner offices get earned in places like Hargrove Capital, through a combination of genuine competence, careful relationship management, and the accumulation of enough institutional knowledge to make yourself seem indispensable. Vanessa walked in at 11:05 without knocking. Thomas was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading something on his monitor. He looked up when she entered. His expression moved through several stages in about 2 seconds. Surprise, a kind of recalibration, and then the composed professionalism he reached for reflexively in situations that required it. Vanessa, he said, I was going to come find you. Derek's team briefed me this morning on where the investigation stands, and I want to... The document access log, she said. She stood in front of his desk. She didn't sit down. He stopped. 11 specific documents were removed from the Meridian due diligence package after receipt from Meridian's legal team and before distribution to the advisory firms, she said. The access permissions for that document management window apply to 3 people. You're one of them. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face. something controlled and effortful, like a man holding a heavy thing very steady while he figured out what to do with it. "That's a significant allegation," he said. "I haven't made an allegation," she said. "I've described what the access log shows. I'm asking you to explain it." "Document management is a complex process," Thomas said. "Files get moved, organized, reclassified. The absence of a document from a compiled package doesn't necessarily indicate—" "Thomas," her voice was flat, not angry, something past anger, colder. 7 documents, including the cross-collateralization disclosure, including the subsidiary operating agreement that would have flagged a $2 billion liability to anyone who read it. He was quiet. "You've been at this company for 12 years, she said. "You've built deals that made this firm significant. I brought you into the inner circle of every major acquisition we've done in the last 4 years because I trusted your judgment and your integrity." She paused. "Tell me I'm wrong about what the access log means." Thomas looked at his desk, then at the window, then back at her. And in that sequence of looks, Vanessa saw the answer. Not a confession, because Thomas Wren was not a man who would give her a clean confession in the first conversation, but an absence. The absence of the outrage that should have been there. The absence of the immediate, energized denial of a man who was genuinely innocent and understood what was being implied. "I think I should speak with legal before we continue this conversation," he said. "That's your right," she said. "Legal is available." She looked at him for one more long moment. "But I want you to understand something, Thomas. Whatever arrangement you made, whoever you made it with, when that deal closed and the cascade triggered, this company would have gone through a crisis that would have affected every person who works here. Every analyst, every assistant, every employee in every department. The people who've been here for 20 years, the people who started last month." She paused. "They didn't know they were collateral." Thomas said nothing. Vanessa turned and walked out of his office without waiting for a response. She was back in conference room 4 by 11:30, and the energy in the room had shifted in the way rooms shift when they've been working towards something and have started to see its outline clearly. Priya had filled both whiteboards. Mason was standing to one side, coffee in hand, looking at the structure they'd built up over the past 3 hours with the expression of someone checking a proof. "What's the financial relationship between Thomas Wren and Langford Group?" Vanessa said from the doorway. Derek looked up. "We found a consulting agreement," he said. "Personal services, not disclosed to Hargrove. Langford Group was paying him a retainer through a personal LLC he set up 18 months ago. The LLC is listed as a financial consulting service." He let the implication sit. The timing corresponds to the period when the Meridian deal was first being sourced. Vanessa stood in the doorway and felt the whole picture settle into place. The shape of it, the logic of it, the particular ugliness of a betrayal that had been constructed carefully and over time. Thomas hadn't stumbled into this. He'd built it. 18 months of retainer payments, 8 months of internal championing, a carefully curated documentation package, 2 advisory firms working blind from incomplete information, all of it designed to deliver Hargrove Capital into a crisis that would benefit the people who had paid him to engineer it. "He was going to let it happen," Priya said. She said it quietly, not as analysis, but as something more personal. The reaction of someone in their 20s who had been working at Hargrove for 2 years and had just understood what that meant for people like her. Nobody responded to that directly because there wasn't a good response. Mason set his coffee down. "The Langford Group principals," he said. He turned to look at Vanessa. Marcus Hale and Dennis Proft. The names landed in the room like stones dropped in water. Vanessa looked at him. "You know them?" "They were senior partners at Whitfield Vance," Mason said. He said it evenly, the way he said most things, but there was something in the stillness underneath it. The stillness of someone saying a thing they've been carrying for a long time. They were the ones who built the fund performance manipulation structure. They were the ones who coordinated the blacklisting. A brief pause. After the SEC settlement, they changed the name and the address, but they kept the methodology. "The same registered agent," Derek said. "The same registered agent," Mason confirmed. "Same construction, different deal, different target. They've done this before." probably more than once between Whitfield Vance and now. We've only been looking at Meridian. He looked at the whiteboard. If you look at the acquisition landscape in this sector over the past 4 years, there are probably 2 or 3 other deals where the structure looks similar. Companies that ran into unexpected liability exposures after close. Deals that collapsed in ways that created distressed asset opportunities. The room absorbed that. Carmen Reyes was writing steadily. This goes well beyond a civil disclosure violation, she said without looking up. If what you're describing is accurate and documentable, this is securities fraud, conspiracy, potentially wire fraud given the interstate element. She looked up. This is a federal case. Yes, Mason said. You've been here before, Carmen said, with Whitfield Vance. Yes, he said again. And you understand what happens to the person who provides the referral package, Carmen said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just precise in the way lawyers are precise, naming the thing that was in the room so that it could be accounted for. Mason looked at her steadily. I understand what can happen, he said. I have a different kind of documentation this time. Vanessa looked at him. What do you mean? He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small external hard drive, the kind that fit in a palm, black, worn at the edges from use. He set it on the table. I've been building a file since I found the discarded draft, he said. Cross-referenced analysis of the subsidiary structures, the registered agent connections, the timeline of the Langford Group's formation and its capital raise relative to the Whitfield Vance settlement. It's not complete. I didn't have access to the internal documents, but it's enough of a frame. He looked at Vanessa. Combined with what your team has pulled in the last 36 hours, it's more than a referral. It's a full forensic package. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Derek said, You've been building this for 6 weeks. Longer, Mason said. I've been building pieces of it for about 3 years. The Meridian draft just gave me the connective tissue. Vanessa looked at the hard drive on the table. She thought about the tattoo on his forearm, the mathematical notation, the formula fragments, the compact diagrams. She'd been thinking about it since the boardroom. She thought she understood it a little better now. Not decorative, not memorial exactly, but the physical evidence of a mind that worked in a particular way and needed to keep certain structures close. The kind of notes a person made when they couldn't trust any paper or any system to hold things safely, and their own body was the only storage they fully controlled. Mason, she said. He looked at her. When you came into that boardroom on Tuesday morning, she said, you didn't know any of this. The Langford connection, Thomas Wren, none of it. You just knew the acquisition document had a problem. Yes, he said, and you stopped anyway. Knowing what happened last time, you stopped something. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that the room felt it. My daughter asked me last night, he said, why I came home looking the way I was looking. I told her I'd had an interesting day at work. She asked if interesting was good or bad. I said I wasn't sure yet. He looked at the hard drive on the table. She said interesting usually means something's about to change. The room was quiet. She's 7, Derek said. She's perceptive, Mason said. Vanessa picked up the hard drive. She held it for a moment and then set it in front of Carmen Reyes. Get your contact at the SEC field office, she said to Carmen, the one you used on the Trident matter 3 years ago. I want a preliminary conversation today. Not a formal referral yet, just a conversation. She looked at Priya. Compile everything from the last 36 hours into a working document and flag the strongest documentary threads. She looked at Derek. I need a complete accounting of every deal Thomas Wren has sourced or significantly influenced in the past 4 years. Everyone. The room started moving. Vanessa stood at the head of the table and felt the particular weight of a moment where multiple things were simultaneously true. They had saved the company, and the saving wasn't over. A man who had been betrayed once by doing the right thing was about to do it again. And somewhere in this building, 30 floors below, 2 men who had spent years constructing elaborate architectures of deception were sitting in their offices without knowing that the structure had just cracked open from a direction they hadn't thought to guard. She looked at Mason. He was back at the whiteboard, adding something to the structure, his sleeve pushed back, the tattoo visible, the notation dense and precise. Mason, she said. He turned. Emma's right, she said. Something's about to change. He looked at her for a moment, and for the first time since she'd met him, something in his face shifted just slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. The territory of a man who had been in the dark long enough that the first real edge of light registered on him, whether he meant it to or not. He turned back to the whiteboard. "Let's finish building this," he said. Thomas Wren cleaned out his office at 4:30 that afternoon, escorted by Patricia Voss and 2 members of building security. He did it quietly, without a scene, which was consistent with who he was, a man who understood that certain moments required a kind of dignity that had nothing to do with innocence and everything to do with how you carried what you'd done. He took his personal photographs, his pen set, a small plant he'd kept on the windowsill for 6 years. He left his Hargrove Capital business card holder on the desk. Patricia Voss walked him to the elevator. They didn't speak. When the doors opened, Thomas stepped in and turned around, and for a moment he and Patricia were looking at each other across the threshold. "How long did you know?" he asked. "Longer than you'd like," she said. The doors closed. Patricia stood at the elevator bank for a moment, looking at where he'd been. Then she turned and went back to work. The SEC field office contact Carmen Reyes reached was a senior examiner named Daniel Farrow, who had been with the commission for 16 years and had the particular economy of speech that develops in people who spend their careers reading between lines. He listened to Carmen's preliminary outline on Thursday afternoon without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, and said he'd call back within 2 hours. He called back in 40 minutes. The conversation that followed lasted just under an hour, and by the end of it, Carmen had arranged an informal documentation review for the following Monday. Not yet a formal investigation opening, but the meeting before that meeting, the kind where a federal examiner comes in with a yellow legal pad and leaves with a hard drive and a document package and a set of questions that will take a year to fully answer. Vanessa was in her office when Carmen briefed her at 7 that evening. The building was mostly quiet by then. The ordinary Thursday evening emptying out of a corporate floor, elevators running less frequently, the cleaning staff beginning their rounds. Vanessa was aware, in a way she hadn't been before Tuesday, of who was doing that work and what they carried with them when they did it. "Farrow knows the Whitfield Vance case," Carmen said. "He wasn't on it directly, but he knows the structure and he knows the settlement. When I mentioned the registered agent connection, he stopped asking questions and started listening differently." "What does that mean practically?" Vanessa asked. "It means that if Mason Reed's documentation holds up, and from what I've reviewed, it will, the Whitfield Vance settlement is going to be looked at as the opening chapter of an ongoing pattern rather than a closed matter." Carmen paused. "That changes the exposure picture for Marcus Hale and Dennis Proft significantly. Settlement doesn't provide protection against evidence of continued conduct." Vanessa absorbed that. "And Thomas? Thomas Wren is a separate matter but a related one. The consulting agreement, the document removal, the timeline, it builds a picture of deliberate facilitation. His lawyer reached out to me this afternoon." Carmen set her legal pad on the desk. "He wants to talk about cooperation." Vanessa looked at the legal pad without reading it. "Let him talk." Carmen nodded and gathered her things. At the door she paused. "Vanessa, the Langford Group, Hale and Prof, when they find out the deal has collapsed and a federal examiner is coming, they're going to understand fairly quickly what happened. They'll know someone had the forensic picture. They'll have a short list of people capable of building it." "I know," Vanessa said. "Mason Reed is on the 42nd floor on his scheduled Tuesday and Thursday rotation." "Not anymore," Vanessa said. "I'm handling that." Carmen looked at her for a moment and then left without further comment. Mason didn't answer the first call. He was at Emma's school pickup, the kind of thing that had its own irreducible priority, regardless of what else was happening. Standing on the sidewalk outside Pilsen Elementary in the January cold with his hands in his jacket pockets when his phone buzzed, and he let it go to voicemail. He called back 20 minutes later from the apartment, Emma at the kitchen table with her homework, the pasta water already on. "I need to change your building access for the next few weeks," Vanessa said. "You won't be doing the cleaning rotation." He was quiet for a moment. He understood what she wasn't saying. "They know," he said. "Not yet. But when they do, I don't want you walking into a building where two of the principals have office space. She paused. This is not me pushing you out. This is me not being careless about your safety. He leaned against the kitchen counter and watched Emma erasing something on her worksheet with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided mattered. The pasta water hadn't started boiling yet. The apartment was warm in that particular way of small spaces with good radiators in cold cities. Okay, he said. The Monday meeting with the SEC examiner, Vanessa said. I'd like you there, in person, with your documentation. Carmen will walk you through the format. I've done this before, he said. I know. I just want to make sure you know we're doing it differently this time. You won't be an unnamed internal source. You'll be there with Hargrove's legal team behind you. He was quiet again. On the other end of the phone, Vanessa heard a child's voice. Not the words, just the tone, the specific frequency of a 7-year-old narrating something to a parent who is nearby but momentarily occupied. That's Emma, Mason said, not explaining, just acknowledging. Go, Vanessa said. I'll have Carmen send you the Monday details. The call ended. Mason put his phone in his pocket and turned to the stove and turned the heat up under the pasta water, and Emma looked up from her homework and said, Was that your work? Yes, he said. Is everything okay? He looked at her, this small, specific, particular person who was the reason he'd stayed sane through 4 years of losing things and rebuilding around the loss. Getting there, he said. She seemed to accept this and went back to her worksheet. Friday moved through its hours with the particular compressed urgency of a day when multiple things are simultaneously unresolved. Derek Cho's team completed their full documentation of the Meridian liability structure and cross-referenced it against 3 additional acquisition deals in the sector over the past 4 years. Of those 3, 2 showed structural similarities significant enough to warrant flagging. Different companies, different targets, different geographies, but the same registered agent, the same offshore jurisdictions, the same pattern of excluded subsidiary documentation. Priya brought the summary to Vanessa at 2 in the afternoon and set it on her desk and stood back with the expression of someone presenting something they found genuinely disturbing. 2 other companies, Vanessa said, reading. Amberton Financial Services in 2022 and Crestwood Capital Group in 2023, Priya said. Both ran into significant post-acquisition liability exposures. Amberton went through a distressed restructuring. Crestwood sold off 2 core asset portfolios at below-market valuations within 6 months of close. She paused. Langford Group acquired both asset portfolios. Vanessa set the summary down. She thought about Marcus Hale and Dennis Proft, sitting 30 floors below in their Langford Group offices, doing whatever they did on Friday afternoons, unaware that the week had gone the way it had. She tried to picture them, their specific faces, the texture of who they were. She couldn't, quite. She'd never met them. She knew them only through their work, which was the architecture of harm, built carefully and over time, behind closed doors, using other people's trust as a structural material. She thought about Mason Reed at 29 or 30, walking into Whitfield Vance as their head of forensic analysis, probably thinking he was walking into a career-defining role, the version of him that existed before 4 years of systematic dismantling. She wondered what that person had been like, how much of the steady, weathered man she'd met on Tuesday remained from that version, and how much had been forged in the years between. Send this to Carmen, she said. Flag the Amberton and Crestwood connections specifically. Farrow will want this for Monday. Priya nodded and left. Vanessa sat at her desk for a long moment. Then she called Patricia Voss. The Langford Group tenants in the building, she said when Patricia answered. I need to understand our lease situation with them. Their lease runs through 2026, Patricia said. Standard commercial terms. No unusual clauses. Is there anything in our tenant conduct provisions that would apply to a situation where a tenant organization is under active federal investigation? A brief pause. Potentially. Depends on how the investigation is characterized. I'll pull the lease document. Do that, Vanessa said. I'm not moving yet. I just want to know what the options are. She hung up and stood and went to the window. The lake was visible today for the first time all week. a thin gray line at the horizon beyond the northern skyline, the sky above it white and cold. She looked at it for a long time. 12 years she'd known Thomas Wren. He'd been in the room for some of the best deals Hargrove had ever done. He'd given her genuinely good counsel at moments when she'd needed it. None of that had been false, exactly. Whatever led him to what he'd done, the competence had been real, the counsel had been real, which was the part that was hard to hold. Betrayals by people who were entirely bad were straightforward. Betrayals by people who were also genuinely good at their jobs and sometimes kind to you, those left a different kind of residue. She thought about what Mason had said in the coffee shop, about being right and still underestimating the response, about thinking exposure would be enough. She understood that differently now than she had 2 days ago. Marcus Hale found out on Saturday morning. It came through Thomas Wren's lawyer, who called Hale's personal attorney at 9 a.m. to convey that his client was in preliminary cooperation discussions with federal authorities and that the Meridian acquisition matter had developed significant investigative dimensions. The call lasted 11 minutes and was received by Hale in the kitchen of his Lincoln Park home in his weekend clothes with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He called Dennis Proft immediately after. Proft was at his health club. The conversation was brief and conducted in the careful, partial language of two men who understood instinctively that certain things should not be said on phones. By noon, both of them were in the Langford Group conference room on the 33rd floor of Hargrove Tower, with their respective personal attorneys and a sense of compressed, airless urgency that Hale at least recognized from a previous experience with a previous firm, 4 years ago, when things had also moved suddenly and faster than anticipated. The Hargrove CEO, Hale's attorney said. She's been working this since Tuesday? That's what Wren's lawyer is saying, Hale said. He had the particular quality of a man who was angry but had enough experience to channel the anger into forward motion thinking rather than combustion. He was 61, silver-haired, with the physical stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to read rooms without showing what he was reading. The signing was supposed to happen Tuesday morning. Something stopped it. Someone stopped it, Proft's attorney said. Wren said there was an incident in the boardroom, Proft said. He was 58, heavier than Hale, with less of the stillness and more of the contained agitation of a man who did not handle uncertainty as gracefully. Before the signing, a maintenance worker came into the room. A silence. He said the signing was delayed because of a maintenance worker, Hale's attorney repeated. That's what he said. Hale looked at his attorney, then at the table. He was running something in his head. Proft could see it, the way you could always see Hale running something even when his face gave nothing away, just from the quality of the silence. Mason Reed, Hale said. Proft looked at him. Building services on 42, Hale said. It's been 3 years since I've thought about that name, but I'm thinking about it now. He looked up. Dennis, when did we last review the Hargrove Tower tenant directory against the building staff roster? Proft stared at him. We never... No, Hale said. We didn't. He sat back. We assumed the maintenance staff was irrelevant. The silence in the Langford Group conference room had a different quality than the silence in Hargrove's boardroom on Tuesday morning. This one had the particular texture of men understanding that something had already happened to them and that the only questions remaining were about scale and consequence. Well, Vanessa found out about the Saturday Langford meeting through Patricia Voss, who had a source in the building's security desk that logged after-hours weekend access. When Patricia called Vanessa at 2:30 Saturday afternoon, Vanessa was at her kitchen table with a coffee and a stack of weekend briefings she hadn't gotten to, and she listened to the summary without speaking. They know, Patricia said, or they know enough. Good, Vanessa said. A brief pause. Good? If they're meeting with their attorneys on a Saturday, they're already in defensive posture. That means they're not spending their energy on offensive moves. She thought about it. Get Carmen on the phone. I want to move the Monday meeting forward if Farrow has any flexibility. Sunday, if possible. Sunday, Patricia repeated. The faster we get the documentation into federal hands, the less runway they have. Vanessa paused. And Pat, Mason Reed's building access badge. Can you disable it remotely? I already did, Patricia said. Yesterday afternoon. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. You didn't wait for me to ask. I thought about what the situation called for, Patricia said simply, and I did it. Thank you, Vanessa said. She hung up and sat at her kitchen table and looked out the window at the Chicago winter, the bare trees in the backyard of the building across the alley, the sky, that particular white-gray that felt like it had been that color forever and would stay that color indefinitely, the specific flatness of the city in January that she'd stopped noticing years ago and was somehow noticing now. She picked up her phone and called Mason. He answered on the second ring. Hale and Proft had a meeting this morning, she said, with their attorneys. They know the deal collapsed and they're putting together what happened. A beat. Okay, he said. His voice was even. She'd noticed that about him, that he received hard information without immediately performing a response to it. Just absorbed it, decided what it meant, then spoke. How are you? She asked. A brief silence. Not the silence of someone not knowing how to answer, the silence of someone slightly surprised by the question. I'm okay, he said. Emma and I went to the Natural History Museum this morning. She has opinions about the Ice Age exhibit. Vanessa laughed. It surprised her, the unexpectedness of it, the specific relief of a genuine laugh in the middle of a hard week. Strong opinions? She thinks the mammoth display is underlit, he said. She told the docent. What did the docent say? He agreed with her, actually. She was still smiling when she said, Carmen is trying to move the SEC meeting to Sunday. If Pharaoh has the availability, I'll be there. Mason. She paused. She'd been turning something over since Friday, since Priya had put the Amberton and Crestwood summary on her desk, since she'd understood the full shape of what Hale and Proft had done across multiple years and multiple companies and multiple sets of people who never knew their losses had been engineered. What they did to you. After Whitfield Vance. Do you understand that what happens Monday is different? You're not alone in this room this time. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I want to make sure you actually know it, she said. Not just intellectually, actually. Another pause. Longer. She heard, faint in the background, Emma's voice saying something about lunch. It's different, he said finally. I can feel that it's different. I'm trying to trust it. That's enough, she said. Trying is enough. Daniel Farrow arrived at Hargrove Capital on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock, which was a measure of how seriously he'd taken Carmen's Thursday call. He came with a colleague, a younger examiner named Walsh, who carried the document cases and said almost nothing. And he shook hands with Vanessa, with Carmen, and with Mason Reed without any particular change in expression, which was the expression of a man who processed everything and revealed nothing until he chose to. They sat in conference room 4. The whiteboards still had the structure on them from Thursday. Priya had photographed it, but left the physical boards intact, which turned out to be useful because Farrow spent the first 10 minutes just looking at it, occasionally asking Mason to clarify a connection or confirm a notation. Mason walked him through it the way he'd walked Derek's team through it, starting with the Schedule F discrepancy, building out through the offshore entity structure, arriving at the registered agent connection and what it meant. He pulled up the hard drive documentation. He laid out the Whitfield Vance parallel with the specific care of someone who understood that the parallel was both his strongest evidence and his most complicated piece of credibility to establish. Farrow listened. Walsh took notes. Carmen sat to one side, present but quiet. At one point, Farrow said, "The Whitfield Vance matter. You were the unnamed referral source." Yes, Mason said. The Commission is aware that the source in that case faced significant professional consequences after the referral. Farrow said it neutrally, without inflection. The Commission's view, with the benefit of hindsight, is that the documentation you provided in that case was accurate, complete, and materially significant to the investigation's outcome. The fact that certain parties were able to limit the legal consequences through civil settlement was a function of prosecutorial decisions, not a function of the quality of your evidence. Mason looked at him. Okay, he said. I'm saying this, Farrow continued, because the documentation you've presented today is of equivalent quality, and the structural connections you've drawn between the two matters are, In my preliminary assessment, substantive. Whatever happened to you as a consequence of the last time you did this, that's not the expected outcome of bringing accurate evidence to this office. Mason was very still for a moment. I appreciate you saying that, he said. I'm saying it because it's relevant to how this process works, Farrow said, with the pragmatic directness of a man who is not being warm so much as being precise. Witness cooperation functions better when the witness understands their standing. They worked through the afternoon. Walsh ordered sandwiches at some point, which appeared on the conference table without ceremony and were consumed without anyone stopping the conversation. Vanessa came and went. She had calls to manage, board members to brief, the ordinary crisis management infrastructure of a CEO, navigating a week that had changed the shape of her company in ways that were still becoming clear. But she was in the room for the last hour, sitting at the far end of the table, listening to Mason and Farrow work through the Amberton and Crestwood connections. At 5:47, Farrow closed his legal pad and looked at Mason across the table. I'm going to ask you something directly, he said. Mason waited. The people this investigation will target have demonstrated in the Whitfield Vance matter a capacity and willingness to respond to federal scrutiny with coordinated personal and professional retaliation against sources, Farrow said. You understand that this investigation will likely be more significant in scope than the last one, which means the potential for that kind of response is higher, not lower. I understand, Mason said. You have a daughter, Farrow said. It wasn't a question. Carmen had clearly briefed him. Yes, Mason said. We have a victim witness support framework that applies to cooperation situations like this one, Farrow said. I want to make sure you know it exists and that it will be available to you. He paused. You don't have to be as exposed this time as you were the last time. Not if you don't want to be. Mason looked at the hard drive on the table, at the whiteboards, at Carmen's legal pad with its careful notes. He looked at Vanessa, who was watching him with the particular expression she'd developed over the course of this week. Something that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration exactly, but was the genuine regard of someone who had looked at a person clearly and seen them fully. Let me ask you something, Mason said to Farrow. Go ahead. Amberton Financial, Crestwood Capital. The people who lost those companies, well, the employees, the investors, do they know what happened to them? Farrow was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Currently, no. Mason nodded slowly. He looked at the table, then at Farrow. Then we should make sure they find out, he said. By the time Daniel Farrow and his colleague left the building at 6:15 with Mason's hard drive and a preliminary document package under formal receipt, the Chicago sky had gone completely dark. The city was lit from below. All those windows and street lights and car headlights running in every direction through the cold air. The lake somewhere to the east beyond the building line, present but invisible the way the lake was in winter. Vanessa walked Farrow to the elevator and came back to conference room 4, where Mason was still sitting at the table. His jacket was on the chair beside him. He was looking at the whiteboard with the expression of a man reviewing something he'd been working on for a long time and had just handed over. She sat down across from him. How do you feel? She asked. He thought about it, really considered it, the way he considered most things. Like I've put something down that was very heavy, he said, and I'm not sure yet what it feels like to not be carrying it. She looked at him. That's honest. It's the only way I know how to be, he said. Outside the conference room window, Chicago ran on in its ordinary evening persistence. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment in Pilsen, Emma Reed was probably doing whatever she did on Sunday evenings, homework, or drawing, or conducting further informed critiques of museum exhibit lighting, waiting for her father to come home. Go, Vanessa said. She's waiting. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket, nodded once, and walked out of conference room 4 toward the elevator, leaving Vanessa alone with the whiteboards and the empty sandwich wrappers, and the specific quiet of a room where something important had just finished. She sat there for a while, not working, not planning, just sitting. Then she turned off the lights and went back to her office. The federal investigation into Langford Group was formally opened on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Mason Reed had walked his cleaning cart through the wrong door and said the sentence that stopped a signing. Vanessa was not in the room when it happened. She was in her office, on a call with two board members who needed to be brought fully current before the news became public, walking them through the week in the careful, factual language of a CEO who had discovered a betrayal inside her own house and was determined to present it clearly rather than defensively. She kept her voice level. She answered their questions directly. She did not minimize what Thomas Wren had done or the structural vulnerability it had exposed. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment, and then Carmen Reyes knocked on the open door and said, "It's official. Farrow filed this morning." "Haley and Proft?" Vanessa asked. "Their attorneys have been notified. Federal preservation orders are in place for the Langford Group's documents and financial records." Carmen paused. "Their office access to Hargrove Tower has been suspended pending the lease conduct review." Vanessa nodded. "And Thomas?" "His cooperation agreement is moving forward. His attorney has been constructive." Carmen set a folder on the desk. "In exchange for cooperation, the government will likely pursue reduced charges. He'll lose his industry licenses permanently. He'll face civil liability. He won't be working in finance again." She looked at Vanessa steadily. "Is that enough for you?" Vanessa thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "It has to be," she said. "What I want and what the legal system produces are two separate things. I've accepted that." Carmen picked up her folder. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, the board meeting next week. The way you handled this, the speed of the response, the quality of the documentation package we brought to the SEC, that's going to matter to them." "I know," Vanessa said, "but that's not why it was done." Carmen looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and left. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of aftermath, not resolution exactly, because resolution implies a clean ending, and this was not that, but the gradual restabilization of a structure that had been shaken and was finding its new level. Hargrove Capital held its board meeting. The board received the full account, asked the questions boards ask, expressed the mixture of concern and confidence that boards express when a CEO has managed a crisis competently, and authorized a comprehensive internal review of acquisition processes and document management protocols. The Meridian deal was formally terminated. Meridian's principals, who had structured the liability concealment architecture that Mason had identified, were named in the federal investigation as cooperating targets. They'd had their own exposure in the structure. And when Farrow's team began moving, they moved quickly toward cooperation in exchange for reduced culpability. The liability cascade that would have destroyed Hargrove Capital belonged, in the end, to Meridian itself, which faced its own existential reckoning. Derek Cho rebuilt his due diligence protocols from scratch. He did it with Mason Reed's help, across 3 working sessions in Conference Room 4 over the span of 2 weeks, going through the existing framework piece by piece and identifying the gaps, not just the gaps that had allowed the Meridian documentation to be manipulated, but the systemic vulnerabilities that made that manipulation possible. It was detailed, unglamorous work. Derek, to his credit, did not perform gratitude about it or make the sessions into anything other than what they were, a professional with a knowledge gap working with someone who could fill it. At the end of the 3rd session, when the revised protocol was complete and printed, Derek looked at Mason across the table and said, "I should have caught this. The Schedule F discrepancy. I should have caught it at the first review stage." Mason looked at him. "The discrepancy was designed to be missed," he said. "It was buried at the right depth, in the right kind of notation, with just enough plausibility in the surrounding numbers to let the eye slide past it. That's skill, not your failure." Derek was quiet for a moment. "That's generous?" "It's accurate," Mason said. "There's a difference." Derek looked at the printed protocol. "For what it's worth," he said, "I owe you something I don't fully know how to express professionally." "You don't owe me anything," Mason said. "The protocol is right now. That's what matters." What? Vanessa made Mason an offer in the 3rd week of February on a Tuesday afternoon in her office. She'd thought about how to structure it carefully, not in the way of someone trying to craft a gesture, but in the way of someone who understood that the thing being offered needed to actually fit the person receiving it, or it was worth nothing. I want to create a position, she said. Head of Acquisition Risk Assessment. The mandate is specifically forensic review, pre-acquisition documentation analysis, subsidiary structure verification, the kind of deep layer work that the standard due diligence process misses by design. Mason sat in the chair across from her desk. He'd come from Emma's school. There'd been a parent meeting in the morning, and he had the slightly distracted quality of a father transitioning between his daughter's world and this one. He was listening carefully. The position reports directly to me, Vanessa continued. Not to Derek, not to the acquisitions team. To me. That's deliberate. It needs independence from the deal sourcing chain to be effective. She paused. The compensation is in line with a senior director role. The structure is flexible. I'm not going to tell you what your hours look like or whether you work from this building or from wherever works for your situation. The deliverables are defined, not the schedule. Mason looked at her. You built this around my situation. I built it around what the company needs, she said, which happens to align with your situation. She held his gaze. That's not charity. You've seen what happened when this function didn't exist in a meaningful way. I'm not interested in it not existing again. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk, at the window, at whatever middle distance people look at when they're actually thinking rather than performing thought. The license issue, he said. My Series 65 lapsed under dispute. I can't practice as a registered financial advisor without it. I know, she said. Carmen has already looked at the framework. The position is structured as a corporate internal role, not a registered advisory function. You'd be operating as an employee with defined internal scope, not as an external advisor. The license issue doesn't apply. He looked at her. You already worked this out. I work things out before I present them, she said. Yes. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. The expression of a man who had been operating for a long time in a mode of expecting the floor to hold and then finding it didn't, and was now encountering a floor that seemed to be holding and wasn't entirely sure yet how to weight it. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The Series 65 itself, she said. The complaint process that caused the lapse. Farrow's team has flagged it as part of the pattern of coordinated retaliation. That means there's a basis for a formal challenge to the lapse determination. It won't be quick. Carmen thinks 18 months to 2 years depending on how the federal investigation develops and what it establishes about the coordination. But there's a path. Mason looked at her for a long moment. The office was quiet. The city was below them in the February light. Still cold, still flat and gray, but with something slightly different about it that might have been the first theoretical suggestion of the year eventually turning. I want to be honest with you about something, he said. Okay, she said. The last time I was in a room like this, he said, being offered something by someone who had institutional power and said they were on my side, it went badly. Not because the offer was false exactly, but because I trusted the structure more than the structure deserved. He paused. I'm not saying that's what this is. I'm saying I noticed my own hesitation, and I think you should know it's there. She held his gaze. That's fair, she said. I also notice, he said slowly, that you didn't have to tell me about the license path. You could have just offered the position and let the license be a separate, unrelated thing I dealt with on my own. You told me because you wanted me to have the full picture. Yes, she said. He nodded. Okay, he said. I'll take the position. She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. It was not a dramatic moment. No music, no ceremony, just two people shaking hands in an office on a Tuesday afternoon with the city running 42 floors below them and everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks settling into its permanent place in both of their histories. One condition, he said. She raised an eyebrow. I need to be able to leave by 3:30 on school pickup days. Non-negotiable. Non-negotiable, she agreed. Okay. The investigation moved at the pace investigations move, which is to say, slowly and with periodic surges of intensity that came without much warning. Marcus Hale and Dennis Proft were formally charged in April with securities fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and market manipulation. The charges named Hargrove Capital as the primary intended target and identified Amberton Financial and Crestwood Capital as prior victims in an established pattern. Both men surrendered to federal custody on the same morning, which was a Wednesday, which was the kind of detail that didn't mean anything symbolically and somehow stayed with you anyway. Mason was not in the courtroom when the charges were read. He was in conference room 4, working through the due diligence documentation on a mid-size acquisition that Hargrove was considering in the industrial logistics sector. It was unglamorous work: dense financial documents, subsidiary structures, registration filings from 3 different states. And he did it with the same focused attention he brought to everything, a cup of coffee at his elbow going cold the way it always did when he was deep in something. Priya knocked on the door at 10:15 and said, "Farrow's office just called. The charges went through." Mason looked up from the documents. "Okay," he said. Priya waited a moment, as if expecting something more. "That's it? Just okay?" He looked at her. "What else should there be?" She thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe something. It's a big deal." He picked up his coffee and found it cold and set it back down. "It's the right outcome. Outcomes that should happen sometimes do. That's worth something." He looked at the documents. It doesn't undo anything. It doesn't give Amberton their company back or give Crestwood their portfolios back. The people who lost the things because of what Hale and Proft built, they had those losses before today, and they'll have them after today. He paused. "I'm glad the charges went through. I'm not sure glad covers it, and I'm not going to pretend it does." Priya stood in the doorway for a moment. "That's more honest than most people would be." "Most people haven't been through this before," he said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. She left him to his documents. He told Emma that evening. Not the full picture, She was 7, and the full picture was not a 7-year-old's to carry, but enough. He told her that some people who had done something wrong for a long time had been caught, and that the catching had something to do with the interesting week he'd had back in January. Emma considered this with the serious, slightly sideways thinking that was characteristic of her approach to most things. "Were they bad people?" she asked. "They made bad choices," he said. "Whether that makes them bad people, I don't know. It's a harder question than it sounds." She chewed on that. They were at the kitchen table, the remains of dinner between them, the apartment warm in the way it was warm, the street noise coming up from outside. "Did they know they were hurting people?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Then I think that matters," she said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to hedge her conclusions. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It does?" She went back to her homework. He cleared the dinner plates and stood at the sink and looked out the kitchen window at the Pilsen alley, the fire escapes, the back walls of the buildings across the way, the specific urban geometry of a neighborhood that had never been glamorous and had always been real. And he thought about what she'd said and decided she was right, which was a thing that happened with some regularity. In March, Vanessa gave a talk to Hargrove Capital's full staff. Not a town hall exactly, but close. 200 people in the building's main conference center on the 28th floor. The whole company gathered in person for the first time since the crisis had become public. She stood at the front without notes, which was not her usual practice, and she said what she actually thought rather than what had been approved by communications. She talked about the acquisition process and what the review had found and what was being changed. She talked about Thomas Wren without naming him, speaking about what had happened in the language of structure rather than individual culpability, because the staff deserved to understand the system failure without being handed a single person to project everything onto. She talked about what the company had come close to losing, not abstractly, but specifically in the language of departments and roles and the people who filled them. And then she said something that was not in any strategic communication plan, and that she said anyway, because it was the true thing. "The reason this company still exists in the form it does," she said, "is because of someone who saw something that was wrong and said so, in a room full of people who had every credential he didn't and every reason to dismiss him. He said it knowing what it had cost him the last time he'd done it. He said it anyway." She looked out at the 200 faces. "I want you to understand that the most important person in this room on the day that mattered was not the CEO. It was not the CFO or the legal team or the advisory firms. It was a man who cleaned this floor on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and had enough integrity to say a thing that needed to be said when saying it was expensive. The room was very quiet. "I think about that a lot," she said. "I think about what it means for how we look at each other, who we assume has something worth listening to and who we don't. I got that wrong in a specific way that week, and I've been thinking about how I got it wrong ever since." She paused. We have a tendency in places like this to think that titles and credentials and the vocabulary of expertise are the same thing as judgment. They're not. They're related sometimes, but they're not the same thing, and every time we act as if they are, we cut ourselves off from something real. She stopped there. She didn't wrap it up with an action plan or a corporate commitment or a set of measurable objectives. She just let it sit, because the thing she was trying to say was not an action plan. It was a recalibration, and recalibrations don't come with deliverables. Mason was not in the room. He'd been in it for 5 minutes before it started, checked his phone and seen a message from Emma's school about a scheduling change, and slipped out before the talk began. He caught the summary from Priya afterward, who relayed it in her characteristically direct way. "She talked about you," Priya said, "without naming you, but everyone knew." "Okay," he said. "Are you okay with that?" He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She said the most important person that week wasn't the CEO. He was quiet for a moment. "She was wrong about that, by the way." Priya looked at him. "She's the one who stopped," he said. "In that boardroom. I said a sentence. Dozens of people had the information to say that sentence before I did, including people who were paid specifically to find it. She's the one who heard it, from someone she had every organizational reason to dismiss, in the middle of $1 billion signing, and she stopped." He paused. "That's the harder thing, actually. Saying something costs something. Listening costs something different. I'm not sure which is more expensive." Priya thought about this. "I'm going to write that down," she said. "Don't put my name on it," he said. By the time Chicago moved into a genuine spring, the kind that arrived in April with tentative warmth and then went back to cold for 2 weeks as if reconsidering, Mason Reed had been in his new role for 6 weeks. He had an office on the 42nd floor, which was a strange thing to have and which he had not fully made peace with. It was a small office, north-facing, with a view of the river and a bookshelf he'd started filling and a whiteboard that he used constantly, and a desk that he sometimes forgot to sit at because he thought better standing. Patricia Voss stopped by one morning and stood in the doorway looking at the whiteboard, which had 3 different financial structures diagrammed on it in Mason's dense, precise notation. "You need a second whiteboard," she said. "I've been using the back of the first one," he said. "That's not a solution, it's a workaround." "Most solutions start as workarounds," he said. She looked at him with the expression she'd developed for moments when he said something that was technically true and also slightly annoying. "I'll requisition a second whiteboard," she said, and left. He looked at his diagrams. The current acquisition under review was a mid-sized technology services company in the Midwest. Straightforward structure, reasonably clean documentation, no obvious anomalies in the subsidiary filings. It was the kind of deal that should have been fine and probably was fine, and that he reviewed with the same methodical attention as if it were the Meridian package, because the point was not to find problems, it was to be certain enough to know when there weren't any. His phone buzzed. A text from the school. Emma had won the 2nd grade science fair with her project on bridge load distribution. The text included a photograph. Emma standing next to a model bridge made of popsicle sticks and string, holding a ribbon, wearing the expression of someone who had known she was going to win and was politely not making a big deal about having been right. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. He thought about the version of himself from 4 years ago, the one who had done the right thing and watched it cost him nearly everything: the job, the license, the professional identity he'd built over a decade. The version of himself who had spent 3 years being invisible, because invisible was the only safe thing to be. He thought about what it felt like to carry $2 billion of knowledge through a building every Tuesday and Thursday morning and not know what to do with it. He thought about the moment in that boardroom when he'd almost made it to the door, the particular specific weight of turning around. He sent Emma a text back. A single line that said, "I knew it. Save me a piece of cake if there's cake." Then he put his phone face down on the desk and went back to the financial structure on his whiteboard, Because the work was real, and it mattered, and it was his, in a way that work hadn't been his in a long time. On a Thursday evening in late April, Vanessa stayed at her desk until nearly 7, finishing the quarterly report review that the board would receive the following week. The building had emptied out around her in the ordinary way, the lights on the surrounding floors blinking off one by one, the elevator activity slowing, the city outside shifting from the dense movement of rush hour into the quieter flow of evening. She was reading a section on risk management protocols, the revised version, which included the new acquisition review framework, which included the role that Mason Reed now filled, when she looked up for no particular reason and looked out the window. 42 floors below, at the street-level exit of Hargrove Tower, she could see the small figures of people leaving for the evening. The doorman in his coat, the revolving door catching the last of the April light, the sidewalk busy with the ordinary Thursday evening traffic of a financial district block, people with bags and phones, and the particular purposeful walk of people going somewhere they wanted to get to. Among them, she saw a figure she recognized by his posture more than anything else. The height, the particular quality of stillness, even in motion, the way he moved through a crowd without adjusting to it, as if he'd always known exactly how much space he occupied and didn't need to verify it. He had a small person beside him, holding his hand, too small to see clearly from 42 floors up, but present and specific, the particular presence of a child who was keeping up with an adult's pace and making it look easy. Mason and Emma, heading home on a Thursday evening in the spring. Vanessa watched them until they turned the corner at the end of the block and went out of sight, absorbed into the ordinary moving texture of the city, the way people are when they're just living their lives. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the week in January when she'd almost signed a contract that would have destroyed everything she'd spent 4 years building. She thought about the cleaning cart and the boardroom door and the sentence that had stopped time. She thought about a 7-year-old's opinions on museum lighting and popsicle stick bridges, and whether knowledge about an Ice Age exhibit could travel 42 floors up and still land as something worth caring about. She thought about what it costs to say a hard thing in a room full of people who don't want to hear it. She thought about what it costs to listen. She turned back to the quarterly report. The risk management section read, Hargrove Capital's revised acquisition framework incorporates a dedicated forensic review function with independent reporting authority, designed to provide structural verification at the pre-due diligence stage. Implementation commenced February of this year. No material compliance gaps have been identified in reviews conducted to date. She read it twice. Then she made a small change in the language, removed no material compliance gaps have been identified, and replaced it with the framework has functioned as designed. The first phrasing was defensive. The second was true. Small difference. Not trivial. She saved the document and closed her laptop and stood up and put her coat on and picked up her bag. She looked at the city through the glass. All those lit windows running to the horizon, all those people inside them with all their ordinary and extraordinary circumstances, all those things being carried that no one on the outside could see. She turned off the office light and left. There are things this story is about, if you want to look at it that way. It's about what we assume when we look at a person, the conclusions we draw from a uniform or a title, or the way someone enters a room, how we decide in about 2 seconds what someone is worth listening to, how often we're wrong about that, and how much the wrongness costs us, and how we mostly never find out because the person we dismissed just walked out the door and we never knew what they knew. It's about the particular loneliness of being right in a room that doesn't want to hear it, the specific thing it takes to say the sentence anyway, and turn back toward the door you were already almost through and say it to people who are already calibrating their dismissal. Mason Reed did that once at Whitfield Vance, and it destroyed 4 years of his life. He did it again in that boardroom, and it didn't. The act was the same. The outcome was different. The difference wasn't luck, exactly. It was Vanessa stopping, which was a choice she made, which she could have made differently. That's the part that keeps you up at night if you think about it long enough. Not the heroic act, but the listening. Not the speaking, but the hearing. Mason said a sentence. 100 people could have said that sentence before him, and hadn't. What he did was necessary. What she did, stopping in the middle of $1 billion signing, with 14 people in the room and the Meridian team waiting downstairs, to actually hear an inconvenient truth from someone she had every institutional reason to dismiss. That was the thing that mattered. We tend to celebrate the person who speaks. We should spend more time thinking about the person who listens. It's also about what we carry and how we carry it. Mason had a tattoo of financial notation on his forearm that he'd put there himself. In the years after Whitfield Vance, when he needed to keep certain structures close and couldn't trust external storage to hold them. It was impractical, and it was private, and it was the decision of a man who had learned that the things you depend on can be taken from you, and so you keep the most essential things somewhere no one can reach. There is something in that which is recognizable. Most people have a version of it, the thing they carry on their body, in their habits, in the specific way they move through the world after something has taken a piece of them. The form varies, the function is the same, and it's about fathers and daughters, which is perhaps the simplest part, and the part that holds everything else up. Emma Reed is 7 years old and has strong opinions about museum exhibit lighting and builds load-bearing bridges out of popsicle sticks, and asked her father, when he came home from an interesting day, whether interesting was good or bad. She is the reason he stayed functional through 4 years of losing things. She is the reason he came back to himself in the years in Pilsen, in the small apartment with the good radiators, in the particular way a parent rebuilds around a child because the child needs them to, and needs simply, completely, are the most useful scaffolding there is. He walked her home through Chicago on a Thursday evening in April, holding her hand, and she told him about the science fair ribbon, and he told her he'd always known she'd win, and she said, with the absolute directness of a child who has never needed to perform modesty, "I know." And they walked the rest of the way home without talking, in the good quiet of two people who are comfortable enough with each other that silence doesn't require filling. The city moved around them. The spring light held a little longer than it had the week before. Everything was still complicated and nothing was perfectly resolved, and the federal case would grind through its process for another year or more, and Thomas Wren was somewhere rebuilding whatever came next, and Marcus Hale and Dennis Proft were facing consequences that were significant and still insufficient, and Amberton Financial still didn't have its company back, and Crestwood Capital still had those portfolio losses. That's how it actually goes. Things don't resolve into clean answers. They shift into new configurations that are better or worse than what came before. And you live inside the new configuration and find what's good in it and carry what isn't. Mason Reed walked his daughter home and didn't think about any of this. He thought about whether they had pasta left or whether he needed to stop at the store. He thought about Emma's bridge project and what the judges had said and whether she'd eaten enough at the science fair or if she'd been too excited to eat, which happened. He thought about tomorrow, which was a Friday, which meant conference room 4 in the morning and school pickup at 3:30, and something Emma had mentioned wanting to try making for dinner, a recipe she'd seen somewhere that involved more steps than he was confident she'd accounted for. Normal life, happening inside a larger story. The way it always does. The way, when you think about it, it always has.